Carney's declaration in Thunder Bay as he signed the Great Lakes Protection Act into law. There was no consultation with Washington, no transitional roadmap, just a decisive move, a total ban on water exports from a basin that supplies drinking water to more than 40 million people and underpins roughly $890 billion in economic activity each year. For generations, the Great Lakes region has operated on the basis of an unwritten understanding. 5 vast lakes straddle the Canada-United States border. Both sides jointly manage them, coordinate regulations, and each country draws the water it needs with very few constraints. U.S. states use the water for cities, farms, and factories. Canadian provinces do the same. Almost no one questioned the sustainability of this arrangement, because the sheer volume of water made the risk of depletion seem inconceivable. But then climate change began to push lake levels lower. Droughts across the American Midwest grew more severe and more prolonged. As western states faced worsening water shortages, they increasingly began to look to the Great Lakes as a solution. Proposals emerged to divert water from the region to Arizona, Nevada, or California through large-scale pipeline systems. Some American politicians started speaking of the Great Lakes as a national asset that should be mobilized to meet U.S. domestic needs. Then Donald Trump began issuing threats, vowing to take whatever he deemed necessary. He declared that water flowing through U.S. territory belonged to the United States. He hinted that if Canada refused to cooperate, the U.S. would proceed with extraction anyway and dare Ottawa to stop it. Carney looked at the Great Lakes and recognized something Washington had long taken for granted. Half of the basin lies within Canadian territory. The waters that sustain American cities and farms all flow through Canada first. The water on which U.S. factories and industries depend also originates in Canada. And unlike oil or minerals, water is an irreplaceable resource. When water runs out, an entire regional economy can grind to a halt. Today, we will show how Canada has turned the world's most valuable freshwater system into a source of strategic leverage. How a $890 billion economy now depends on decisions made in Ottawa. And how the Great Lakes, once assumed by many U.S. states to be perpetually available, have become the very factor that drains weight from Trump's threats. But before we go any further, if you're interested in in-depth analysis like this, be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that truly matter. The Great Lakes hold roughly 21% of the world's surface freshwater. Together, Lakes Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario contain more than 6 quadrillion gallons of water. That volume exceeds the combined total of all other freshwater lakes on the planet, with the sole exception of Lake Baikal in Russia. For centuries, this abundance created the impression that water was effectively limitless. Cities rose along the shorelines with the assumption that water would never run short. Agriculture spread across the basin, with irrigation practices facing almost no constraints. Industries used water for manufacturing, cooling, and processing, operating on the belief that supply would always be plentiful. The numbers underscore the importance of this system. More than 40 million people rely on the Great Lakes for their drinking water. The basin generates roughly $56 billion in agricultural output each year, and nearly $890 billion in total economic activity depends on the stability of water from the Great Lakes. That encompasses the entire chain of activity, from manufacturing and inland shipping to power generation, tourism, fisheries, and agriculture, across 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. But around 2010, the picture began to shift in a noticeable way. Water levels across the lakes started to decline. Levels in Lake Superior fell close to record lows. Lake Michigan-Huron dropped to its lowest point in decades. Lakes Erie and Ontario also began to show troubling downward trends. Climate change is accelerating evaporation, while overall precipitation becomes increasingly erratic. Rising temperatures thin winter ice cover, allowing more water to evaporate. Shifting rainfall patterns reduce the inflow that replenishes the lake system. The natural balance that sustained this system for thousands of years is now being disrupted. Faced with their own mounting water crises, many U.S. states have begun looking north. The Colorado River is steadily shrinking. Groundwater reserves in California are being depleted at an alarming rate. Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico are experiencing severe water shortages. Political leaders have started asking why water-rich regions cannot share with areas that are increasingly parched. Why are the Great Lakes able to store trillions of gallons of water while the American Southwest faces the risk of depletion? Proposals to divert water from the Great Lakes westward through large-scale pipeline systems began to emerge. Technical studies indicated that such projects were entirely feasible from an engineering standpoint. At the same time, political support gradually took shape in states suffering from acute water shortages. The argument put forward was relatively simple. Water was framed as a national resource, and from that perspective, Americans facing water scarcity were said to have a right to access water that belonged to their country. But the Great Lakes are not the property of the United States alone. They are a shared water system with Canada. And while American policymakers increasingly planned to draw more water from this system for their own benefit, Canada watched its own water security erode year after year. In theory, Canada has prohibited large-scale water exports since 1999. The principle was clear: water was not to be removed from its natural basin for commercial purposes. No more tankers drawing vast quantities of water from Lake Superior to sell abroad. No more massive pipeline projects transferring water to other countries. But the regulatory framework contained significant loopholes. Bottled water was not classified as a bulk export. Limited transfers for industrial use were still permitted. And more importantly, the ban applied only to exports outside North America, leaving water movement within the continent largely unregulated. If a U.S. state sought to use water from the Great Lakes, the existing rules did not, in practice, fully prevent it. The Great Lakes Protection Act put an end to that. From this point forward, not a single drop of water may leave the basin without explicit approval from the federal government and the provincial authorities. The new regulations cover bottled water produced by corporations such as Nestlé, which have extracted millions of liters each year. They apply to industrial water use as well, and they shut down any proposal to divert water by pipeline to U.S. states outside the Great Lakes Basin. The economic consequences for the United States are profound. Agriculture in states surrounding the Great Lakes depends critically on a stable water supply. Factories across the Midwest rely on lake water for every stage of production, from steel making to food processing. Electricity generation depends on lake water to cool power plants. The Great Lakes shipping system moves hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods each year. All of this now operates under a new reality. Canada holds the legal authority to restrict access if U.S. policy infringes on Canadian interests. Not immediately, not as an act of retaliation, but the legal authority is now firmly in place, and Carney has made it clear that Canada is prepared to use it when necessary. What turns this issue into a source of strategic leverage rather than merely an economic question is a simple reality. Water is irreplaceable. There is no alternative source that can substitute for water from the Great Lakes. It cannot be purchased elsewhere at a reasonable cost. It cannot be created through technology. If the flow of water is disrupted, factories shut down, cities fall into crisis, and agriculture collapses on a massive scale. The United States has no way to guarantee access to this water through military power. Canada controls the critical points where water moves between the lakes. The St. Lawrence Seaway lies entirely within Canadian territory before reaching the Atlantic Ocean. Niagara Falls sits along the border with its flow regulation systems under Canadian control. The outflow from Lake Superior also falls within Canadian jurisdiction. If Canada restricts flows or redirects water at these key points, there is no military solution that could intervene. You cannot attack an ally over a waterway. You cannot bomb the very system that supplies water to your own cities. And you certainly cannot threaten war over lake levels. Donald Trump once believed agricultural tariffs were the lever he could use to pressure Canada. But Mark Carney has demonstrated that Canada holds something far more valuable than wheat or canola. Canada controls the water that sustains American cities and farmland. And unlike food, water cannot be substituted, imported, or traded away. Every major city on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes now understands that its drinking water flows through Canadian territory. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Buffalo. Millions of Americans depend on water that Canada has the legal authority to manage. Agriculture across 8 U.S. states relies on water that originates in or passes through Canada for irrigation. If that flow were restricted, the Midwest would face a water crisis no different in severity from what the Southwest is experiencing today. U.S. manufacturing that depends on Great Lakes water cannot simply relocate. Steel mills in Indiana and Ohio, auto plants across Michigan, chemical complexes along Lake Erie, food processing facilities spread throughout the basin. All of them were built around a water source that Canada now has the legal authority to control. Plans to divert water from the Great Lakes to the southwest were never mere speculation. Engineering firms produced detailed proposals. Political coalitions formed to advocate for these projects. Economic assessments suggested that such investments could avert a regional collapse. Arizona needs water for Phoenix and Tucson. Nevada requires supplies for Las Vegas. California is seeking to rescue rapidly depleting groundwater reserves. Colorado wants to prevent the Colorado River from running dry. New Mexico faces the prospect of agricultural failure without a new water source. All of these plans rested on a familiar assumption: that water from the Great Lakes would always be abundant. Transport costs might be enormous, approval processes might face serious political resistance, but in the end, there was a belief that the water would always be there because it exists on North American territory and because Americans assumed they had a right to access their own resources. The Great Lakes Protection Act brought that line of thinking to an abrupt end. Canada's new law states plainly, no water may be withdrawn from this basin. It does not matter how much water the western states need. It does not matter how much they are willing to pay. And it does not matter how sophisticated the engineering solutions may be, that water will not leave the scope of Canadian jurisdiction. The reaction from US governors in the West was swift and intense. They accused Canada of hoarding resources in the midst of a crisis. They called for negotiations. They pressed Washington to force Ottawa to make concessions. But Carney's response was clear and unequivocal. Canada, too, faces serious risks to its own water security. Canadians must come first when it comes to Canadian resources. Failures in US water policy are not obligations that Canada is required to absorb. Threatening Canada's sovereignty over a trade dispute only hardened Ottawa's resolve to defend its interests. That message quickly gained domestic support. Communities along the Great Lakes are all too familiar with private companies extracting millions of liters of water for bottling and export, even as local water quality continues to deteriorate. They have seen with their own eyes US states preparing large-scale extraction projects, while infrastructure on the Canadian side has remained seriously underinvested. The new export ban has given Canada control over a resource that many assumed was already protected, but which in reality had never been fully secured in legal terms. The figure cited here reflects the scale of annual economic activity across the entire Great Lakes Basin. This is not cumulative value. It is not wealth accumulated over generations. It is the vital annual flow of economic activity that depends directly on a stable water supply. Manufacturing alone accounts for roughly $200 billion. Agriculture contributes an additional $56 billion. Transportation and logistics generate more than $30 billion each year. Power generation, tourism, fisheries, and numerous other sectors make up the remainder. All of these industries operate on a single assumption: that water will always be available, sufficient, and affordable. Once that assumption is shaken, the entire economic foundation begins to look fragile. Canada has not declared any intention to drain the lakes, nor does Carney intend to cut off water to American cities. But the legal authority remains firmly in place, and US businesses are now forced to acknowledge that their continued existence depends on long-term cooperation and goodwill from Canada. This is the leverage, real concrete leverage that cannot be neutralized by tariffs, trade measures, or military threats. Water is an essential, irreplaceable resource, concentrated largely within Canadian jurisdiction. If Trump continues to escalate the trade war, Ottawa can tighten environmental standards, thereby reducing the volume of water that US industries are permitted to use. If US states push forward with new diversion projects, Canada can reject them outright, regardless of political pressure from Washington. If Washington continues to threaten Canada's sovereignty, Carney can simply point to the Great Lakes and remind Trump that millions of Americans depend on water that flows through Canadian territory. Climate change is turning water scarcity into the defining resource challenge of the 21st century. The American Southwest is already in crisis. The Colorado River no longer carries enough water to reach the sea. Aquifers that took thousands of years to form are being drained in a matter of decades. Cities built in the desert are facing the prospect of severe water shortages. The Great Lakes now represent the largest remaining freshwater reserve in North America. Every state facing water stress is looking toward this system and asking how access might be secured. As water scarcity in the United States intensifies, political pressure to override Canada's authority will only continue to grow. But Canada has now sent a clear message that it will not back down. The water export ban has received strong domestic support. Every province bordering the Great Lakes has stood behind the decision. The federal government has committed to enforcing it fully, and the legal framework is now firmly in place. Water belongs to Canada unless Canada itself agrees to a different arrangement. U.S. states may come to the negotiating table. They may propose cooperation, joint infrastructure investment, and